Talk to me. Talk to me.
Hello and welcome. I'm Dan Gersten, host of Chatting with History, where you can listen into conversations I have with some of the most famous characters in the history of Western civilization. And today's guest is no exception. It's Moses, a rather special character, so special in fact we're devoting the entire show to him. In some cultures and religions, Moses is considered to be one of the most influential prophets since the beginning. So without further delay, let's meet Moses. Moses, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Dan.
Well, to begin with, a lot of people, including some who are highly credentialed, believe that you didn't exist and that there was no Jewish nation enslaved in Egypt.
Hello. What am I, chopped liver? I'm considered a prophet in a number of religions, and ancient Greek and Roman historians have cited accounts of my life and accomplishments. Why, even Sigmund Freud wrote a paper about me. Plus, I've been portrayed in the movies and on TV by 3 Academy Award winners. Though, to be honest, I'm rather fond of Mel Brooks's version of me in History of the World Part 1. Well, the bottom line is that people will believe what they want to believe, and it all comes down to fate now, doesn't it? Plus, it's a great story. And one of the things I've learned about stories from back then, that they always have some element of truth to them.
The story of Moses, your story, as I and many others have heard it, begins when you're placed in a basket of reeds and tar, sent floating off in the Nile, and found by the Pharaoh's daughter.
Yes. Well, interestingly, this part of the story has even earlier roots than me. Well, just in that story, the baby was found by a gardener, and in my story, it was a princess.
So here you are, found by the Pharaoh's daughter, raised in the Pharaoh's household. What was that like?
Well, first off, my real sister, seeing that the Pharaoh's daughter had found me, arranged for my real mother to be my nanny. So, while I was growing up in Pharaoh's household, the values and culture of my own people were instilled in me. Well, then, being a prince of Egypt, I was afforded the best schooling possible and had all the privileges and opportunities to which a member of the ruling family was entitled. Plus, I was a pretty good-looking kid, so everybody loved Moses, which, by the way, got me into some trouble.
How so?
I must have been about 2 or 3 years old, maybe younger, and Pharaoh just loved bouncing me on his knee like he was Santa Claus. And I, like most tots, I was attracted to shiny things. And I was always looking for new toys to play with. So I grabbed Grandpa's crown and put it on my head. And, oh, my Lord, you never saw such a commotion. It was like I had just killed the Pharaoh and proclaimed myself the new one. I mean, at least that's what the royal priests were all yammering about some prophecy of somebody stealing Pharaoh's throne. And that I was that somebody. I mean, really now. What kid doesn't like to dress up like mom or dad or grandpa?
So what happened?
Well, they came up with this brilliant idea to see how smart I was, saying that if I was smarter than a 5th grader, I was indeed the prophesied usurper. And if I wasn't, I was just a kid that likes shiny baubles. So they put this really hot coal in front of me as a test. Now, if I avoided the coal, I was smart and thus had to be killed. And if I went for the coal, they figured I wasn't bright enough to steal any throne.
And what did you do?
Well, hello, I went for the coal. I mean, hey, it was shiny and bright and red and glowing, wasn't it?
Yeah, sure.
Wrong. I wasn't going to pick up that coal. No way, no how. But God, you know the guy who works in mysterious ways. He pushed my hand to the coal and made me pick it up. And then, because it was hot, I put it in my mouth and burnt my tongue. Oh boy, I was not a happy camper. But the priest let out a sigh of relief, and most of the others who were present had a good laugh at my expense. And from that day on until recently, I had trouble speaking. And I was embarrassed whenever I had to address anyone.
Yes, we're told you may have had a speech impediment, and that's why your older brother Aaron spoke for you.
Yeah, but Aaron was always looking to show off his own intelligence and like to answer questions put to others before they had a chance to reply. Still, the speech impediment and my being embarrassed by it had a lot to do with Aaron being my spokesperson. In fact, he was probably one of the earliest press secretaries on record.
You know, it seems kind of strange that God didn't just cure you of your speech impediment.
You know, I once thought that way myself, but I later learned the reason that God didn't cure my speech impediment was because I didn't directly ask him to. And maybe I should have, since he caused me to put that coal in my mouth to begin with. Anyhow, as I've thought it, I've had two revelations. The first is that God wants to teach people not to expect that he will cure their impediments and illnesses. I mean, if God didn't cure me, who directly talked and walked with him, well, don't count on him to cure you. And the second revelation is that God didn't want people to miss out on my message by getting lost in how inspiring a messenger I could have been. I mean, whether it be Pharaoh or the people of Israel, he didn't want them to feeling they had just heard a great speaker, yet couldn't recall what I had said. And that seems to be true today. I mean, there are some marvelous, eloquent, and inspiring speakers from the worlds of politics and religion who seem more concerned with their own egos and their ability to impress people than with the quality of their message, their thinking, and their deeds.
Anyway, you don't appear to have any speech impediment now, and let me tell you, that was an eloquent speech.
Well, thank you. But again, don't get lost in the eloquence and lose the message. As for the impediment, hey, this is 2011 AD, and treatments and cures have come a long way, baby.
Yeah, I guess you're happy about that now.
Well, of course. I mean, no matter how confident I may have been, and certainly I had to be confident to lead the people of Israel out of Egypt, I always felt embarrassed about not being able to speak well. And now, there's no stopping me.
So back to you, to Moses. So you grew up a prince of Egypt until one day you ran away a wanted man.
Yes. I saw an Egyptian taskmaster relentlessly beating on a helpless elderly man, and something in me just snapped. I'm not sure what caused me to react so violently, but I did, and next thing I know, I had killed the taskmaster. Well, that made me a criminal, and being a prince wasn't going to save me from a death sentence, so I fled. I headed east, across the Sinai Peninsula, to a place some refer to as Midian. From there, I was welcomed into the family of a local priest. I married his daughter and had a son, and basically took care of sheep. I did that for about 40 years, and well, that's a number that the Old Testament seems enamored with. Before I saw the darndest thing.
The darndest thing?
Yeah, a bush that burned yet was not consumed by the fire.
Wow, that must have been something, no?
That wasn't even the half of it. That damn bush talked.
The bush talked?
Yeah, well, it was not really the bush. It was God pretending to be the bush. He was like that, you know. He was always kidding around. It was hard to take him seriously when he can appear as anything he well pleases. I mean, whether it's a rock, a person, or in this case, a burning bush.
So why did he do it? I mean, why didn't he just speak to you without the bush?
No, I guess it was to get my attention. And it worked, didn't it? I mean, who hasn't heard voices from time to time? I mean, I know I have. But never had I heard a talking, burning bush before.
Wow. And what did the bush, God, I mean, what have to say to you?
Well, basically, I was to get my ass back to Egypt, pick up my brother along the way, and get an audience with the Pharaoh. I'll tell him that I represented the baddest god dude around, and order him to release the Jewish slaves, and then lead them to Canaan, the land of milk and honey. And that if Pharaoh didn't comply, some really nasty things were going to happen.
Yeah, sounds like a plan.
Well, I guess so. Yeah, but as I look back on it, God being the all-knowing person that he's supposed to be, he should have known that Pharaoh wasn't going to comply, no? I mean, at least that's the way I look at it. I mean, so I believe he was playing with Pharaoh, and he really wanted to show off some of the bad things he could do. I mean, it seems God really has this thing about punishing people who don't listen to him. I mean, I heard it all goes back to that garden of his.
Yeah, interesting. Noah had a similar impression of God. Anyhow, so what happened?
Well, I picked up Aaron, like I said, got an audience with the Pharaoh. I told him that my God can beat up his gods, and that he had to let the Jewish slaves leave.
And?
Well, old Pharaoh had a good laugh, as did the rest of his court. There was no way that he was going to let my people go, or any people go. I mean, Egypt's whole economy would have collapsed under such a dramatic decrease in their captive minimum wage labor force.
Sounds like Egypt was outsourcing at home, So then what?
Well, I got into a pissing contest with some of Pharaoh's priests. I mean, I threw down my staff, it turned into a snake. They threw down their staffs, they turned into snakes. Then my snake ate their snakes.
Yeah, that sounds like fun.
Not really. Because even with my snake eating theirs, Pharaoh wasn't going to budge. No way. Which really ticked God off. I mean, the bottom line is that he brought up 9 plagues, each one worse than the other, down upon the Egyptian people. Still, no budge.
9 plagues? I thought there were 10.
God was hoping that 9 plagues would have worked. In fact, he actually ran out of ideas. So he had me tell Pharaoh that the 10th plague would be one that he actually came up with himself.
So?
So, Pharaoh laughed and actually asked whether God had run out of ideas. And then he got really angry, and Pharaoh said he had had enough of this nonsense and that it was now time for him to get in on the punishing. So, he ordered that on the next day, he would have the firstborn males of each Jewish family executed. Little did he know that he had just given a death sentence to the firstborn sons of every Egyptian family.
Sounds a little harsh, no?
Perhaps, but hey, that's what Pharaoh was going to do to each Jewish family, no? Plus, God was really angry. I mean, he realized he had to do something that Pharaoh would understand, sort of a do unto others before they do unto you thing. So he felt that killing Pharaoh's oldest sons and the oldest sons of other Egyptian families, that would get Pharaoh's attention and be, for all intents and purposes, the straw breaking the camel's back.
Yeah, and it was, wasn't it?
Oh, I'll say. That night, the presence of death was everywhere. And no family, Jewish, Egyptian, or what have you, would have been safe. So, the sides and the top of the doorframe of each Jewish family's house was smeared with lamb's blood, so that the angel of death would know to pass over it.
Hence the Jewish holiday of Passover.
Yes, to commemorate the angel of death's passing over Jewish households, as well as their freedom from bondage.
So, back to Pharaoh.
Well, God had read the situation right, and Pharaoh finally did understand whom his adversary was and just wanted all of it to go away. So, the next morning, the Jewish people received the notice for immediate eviction, their walking papers.
And there you have it, or at least half of it. And we'll be back with the rest of the story after a short break. Until then, though, don't pack a suitcase. Hello, and welcome back to Chatting with History, where I've been chatting with Moses. So without further delay, let's get back to our story. So, Moses. One night the Jewish people are slaves, and the next morning they're set free and ordered to leave immediately.
Yeah, it was quite unexpected, really. I mean, sure, killing the firstborn son of each Egyptian household was the most personal and deadly of the plagues to date. But Pharaoh had been pretty stubborn. So, when I was ordered to take my people and leave, I was honestly a little lost. I mean, meeting with Pharaoh and beseeching him to let my people go had been my job, my purpose. And now, it was over. Now I had a new job that was kind of scary. I mean, leading thousands and thousands of people to a new land, and with many of them not really wanting to go.
People living for generations as slaves, and finally after being set free, not wanting to leave? I mean, what was that about?
Well, I guess it's human nature. I mean, many people get used to a pattern, a lifestyle, if you will, and no matter how unhealthy or bad it might be, we're hesitant or fearful to change it. Sort of like being in an abusive relationship that you can't leave, even though it might cost you your life. And I believe some of that was probably going on. It was a big change, and people tend to be uncomfortable with change. I mean, here I was, a person who spoke directly with God, being concerned. Imagine what it was like for the average person.
Never looked at it that way. You know, I always thought that everyone was, well, happy being freed and able to leave Egypt.
Well, most were. Well, still, the Jewish people have been known to have their fair share of kvetchers. And boy, did they kvetch. Right from the start. What do you mean we have to leave? I just got good at making bricks. Now? We have to leave now? The bread hasn't risen yet. The desert? We have to cross the desert? All my summer clothes are in storage. It was awful. Well, especially when Pharaoh started complaining as well. What do you mean you haven't left yet? The new slaves are due in a couple of hours, and we need your huts, etc., etc., etc. And then there were all the questions. What should I pack? Can I take the piano? How many goats am I allowed? I guess I couldn't really blame them for having all these questions and expecting me to have all the answers. And it wasn't as if there were resources or references or travel agents I could use. I was really just making it up along the way.
Yeah, but leave they did.
Yeah, well, we finally got organized enough to pack up and leave. And we left right on time, 3 hours late.
And then what?
Well, we set off for the desert, heading towards the promised land, the land of milk and honey, which wasn't all that attractive to those who were lactose intolerant or allergic to bees.
Yeah, I can imagine. So you're on your way.
Yeah, we were doing pretty well. Well, the kvetching had been reduced to sporadic mumbling, and we were putting some distance between Egypt and us. But it all changed when we got to the water.
Yeah, the parting of the Red Sea.
Red Sea, Reed Sea. I don't even know what sea it was, or even if it was a sea. All I know is that we got to this body of water, and the kvetching started back up. Ha! Some tour. Where are the boats? Sea? We're at the sea? I didn't pack a swimsuit. I'll tell you, it was no day at the beach.
And weren't the Egyptians pursuing you?
We learned that they were. Well, I guess the new slaves didn't show, and they needed our rent money, or else the banks would foreclose on the huts.
Yeah, I can relate to people chasing me for money.
We needed to get to the other side very quickly, where they didn't have jurisdiction.
What happened?
Well, God ordered me to climb up a high rock and raise my staff so the people would see me and have hope.
Yeah, and then the waters parted.
Parted? Yeah, it was more like a comb over. They combed the water one way so we all could get from one side to the other, and then combed the water back afterwards.
And what happened to the Egyptians?
Well, they followed us and got caught when the water combed back over. Boy, was Pharaoh pissed. You could see him on the other side giving us the finger. But we were safe and dry, and it was time for a beach party with blankets and bingo and music like, help me Moses, help me Moses. And Pharaoh's gonna have fun, fun, fun till God took his chariots away. That was really something. You know, I gave both those songs a 10 because they had good beats and catchy lyrics.
Oh, and then?
Well, the next morning, with many of us hung over from the night before, we packed up our stuff and resumed our journey to the promised land. But God wanted us to make one stop before we got there. He said he had something to give us.
The 10 Commandments?
Well, that's what it turned out to be. Well, I first thought he was talking about some kind of medication because he kept referring to the tablets, like they were some kind of pain reliever.
So you made a stop on the way?
Yeah. Well, we stopped at the same mountain where I had seen the burning bush years before, where I first spoke with God. And once we got there, the kvetching started as if it had never stopped. Which, you know, honestly, it never really did. I thought this was a non-stop. The mountains? I went to the mountains last year. Ha! Moses, some prophet. I heard the Arabs will have a guy who'll make the mountains come to him. I couldn't wait to head up that mountain just to be by myself and get away from the incessant complaining.
Didn't you have any concerns about leaving the people alone without their leader?
Well, not at the time. I mean, I left instructions for them to behave, and I appointed Aaron big man on campus and said I'd be right back.
Yeah, but you weren't right back, were you?
No, I wasn't. I didn't think I'd be up there for as long as I was. I thought that God was prepared and was just going to give me what he was going to give me. It turned out he really didn't have his act together. I mean, if I knew I was going to be up there for 40 days and 40 nights, I would have packed a suitcase.
40 days and 40 nights. So where have I heard that length of time before?
Yeah, 40 days and nights is a pretty common biblical time period. But you got to admit, sounds a lot better than, say, 39 days and nights, no?
Yeah, you got me there. So God didn't have his act together?
No, he didn't. Not even close. When I got to the top of the mountain, he was pacing back and forth and muttering to himself.
Muttering?
Yeah, he kept repeating the word loopholes over and over again and asking himself questions like, how many commandments should there be? What day of the week is Sabbath? What if you don't know who your father is?
Well, that's certainly not the picture of the decisive God many of us have.
I don't know where you got that picture. Well, God always struck me as someone who always had good intentions, but was plagued with many of the insecurities and doubts that we all have, and at times with the emotions of a spoiled child who expects the universe to revolve around him. Anyhow, it took me a while before I finally figured out that he was struggling over laws, guidelines, moral code, commandments, if you will, and that he wanted to impart these to the Jewish people. So, as his best friend, I felt I had to help him. Besides, it was the only way I was going to get back to my people before they got into trouble.
So you helped God with the 10 Commandments?
Yes. Well, fortunately, I had some experience in brainstorming. And the first thing I did was to have God agree on the guidelines and rules that would be in place to write the 10 Commandments, like how many there would be and how to determine which commandments made it onto a tablet and which didn't.
And was that easy?
Well, yes and no. It was easy to get him to agree on having guidelines and rules because that's what he was trying to give the Jewish people by writing the 10 Commandments, now wasn't it? Well, the tough part was getting him to agree that he needed guidelines and rules, as he felt he was above the law.
Well, we certainly have some authority figures today who seem to feel that way about themselves.
Yeah, so once he agreed on the guidelines, like there can only be 10 commandments, we devoted ourselves to determining what those commandments would be.
You know, you would figure that God would have had a good handle on what those commandments would be, no?
Well, perhaps. But remember, he really started out with only one simple rule. Don't eat that fruit. And you know what happened then? He got bent out of shape and kind of stepped back and distanced himself. And then when things really headed south around the time of Noah, he felt he had to clean things out and start over. And now I guess he realized the importance of having the laws, his laws, written down and clearly understood. Only there were just so many of them. I mean, he needed help determining the ones that really, really mattered.
And you helped him with this?
Absolutely. Well, first we listed all the possible commandments, the things that are to be done and things that are not to be done. Well, then we grouped them into groups based on common themes, sort of like, okay, these commandments concern interactions with God, so they go over here. And these deal with interactions with others, so they go over there. And these are to do with your parents, so let's break them out and put them here, and so on and so on. And that way we can see overlap and redundancies and combine some commandments into one bigger one, like grouping all the coveting anything that's your neighbors together.
Yeah, I'm impressed. It does sound like you know what you're doing.
Good thing, too. Otherwise, I'd probably still be up on that mountain.
So were you happy with them? I mean, the final 10 Commandments?
Well, I was happy that it was over. And I was happy that there were only 10, which fit nicely onto just 2 tablets. Would have been a bitch walking down that steep trail without carrying anything. Imagine what it would have been like carrying 3 or more tablets. Whew. So as difficult as the walk down was, I drew some comfort in knowing that it easily could have been a lot worse. Well, as far as me being happy with the final 10 commandments, I had mixed emotions about that. Sort of like what God was muttering to himself when I first got to the top of the mountain. Loopholes. And there were just too many loopholes. And I knew that with a lot of Jewish people becoming lawyers and all, well, you get the picture.
Yeah, sure do. You know, it kind of reminds me of the way Congress works now with attorneys writing laws in which other attorneys find loopholes.
You know, the 10 Commandments are no exception. Thou shalt not kill, unless it's to protect yourself. Thou shalt not steal, unless it exposes a crime. Honor your mother and father, unless they abuse you, and so on and so on. And still, it was a start, and I know that the intent behind them was good, and that At least to me, the laws make moral sense and just feel right.
So you headed down the mountain. How were you feeling at this time?
I was feeling pretty good. I had a terrific sense of accomplishment, and I couldn't wait to show and share this wonderful gift that God had given the Jewish people with them.
And all that good feeling vanished once you came down from that mountain.
Sure did. I guess they felt that 40 days and 40 nights didn't translate into, I'll be right back. And they felt abandoned and insecure, and this just allowed some troublemakers, there'll always be troublemakers, to mislead them into building and worshiping a false idol, and to just generally behaving badly. Boy, the scene was right out of Jews Gone Wild.
So
I just lost it. I threw the tablets at the golden calf they had built, destroying that and bringing down the wrath of God on those, and killing everybody that chose not to follow in his and my path. To say the least, it was not a good occasion, as many thousands died that day. Adding to the misery, I had to go back up the mountain to pick up another 2 tablets and bring them back down that steep path.
And then you headed off to the Promised Land?
Well, not directly. It seems we still needed to wander a bit more, for a total of 40 years. Some say this was to make sure that when the Jewish people entered the Promised Land, that none of them would have experienced being a slave. Perhaps, but all I know is that there was no AAA at that time, and all the male leaders, including myself, didn't like stopping to ask for directions.
When it came time to enter the Promised Land, you didn't go with them.
No, I didn't. It seems I pissed God off, and he was punishing me like a parent would a child.
What had you done?
Again, the Jewish people were constant kvetchers, complained that there was no meat, so I had to have a bunch of quail miraculously appear, complained there was no bread, so I had to have manna fall from the heavens, complained there was no water, so I struck a rock with my staff and outpoured water.
Yeah, but that doesn't sound like anything that would piss off God.
Actually, none of that did, since it was God who was pulling my strings. However, on another occasion, when there was no water, once again struck the rock, and it seems that occasion was a no-no. God merely wanted me to talk to it, and my not listening pissed him off. I told him I was distracted, that I had struck a rock before and got water. Still, he wouldn't hear of it. He acted like I had committed an original sin or something. I guess he still has this button about not listening to him that I had inadvertently pushed.
So you never did make it to the Promised Land?
Not that time. Well, I could stand on the mountain and watch my people enter, but at that time, I had to stay behind.
Not at that time?
Well, I've been there a bunch of times since. I've even got a little condo outside of Tel Aviv along the Mediterranean. Well, it's quite lovely. I especially like visiting people when it's Passover. Well, it seems no one can really tell my story like I can. Plus, I love a good brisket, don't you?
Well, that just about brings us to the end of our time with you. But as is customary, are there any final thoughts you'd like to leave with our audience?
Yes, several. Some of which I touched on earlier. First off, don't expect God to cure any impediments or illnesses, physical or otherwise, that you may have. And God may help you to find within yourself the strength, wisdom, and resources you need to overcome them. Plus, some impediments are there to teach us lessons. Secondly, listen to the quality of a person's message, and don't get lost in their eloquence. Many false prophets, people claiming to be God's messengers, speak beautifully, but their message is hollow, especially given their deeds. Third, many laws, as good intentioned as they are just unjust. Most just laws are the ones that come from the heart, and the ones in which there are no loopholes. Lastly, that thing about striking the rock rather than speaking to it, while some may feel that my crime was not listening to God, there's more to that story, and it has to do with the notion that sometimes diplomacy, speaking to the rock to get water, is a more effective tool than force, striking it. My crime was in not recognizing that.
And there you have it, the story of Moses, one of the greatest stories in Western civilization, told by the man himself. So, until our next Chatting with History, this is Dan Gersten, reminding all of you to keep the faith, regardless of what your faith may be. and thank you for watching.
Talk to me.